The year is 1943. The Atlantic wind carries the low hum of Liberty ships slicing through gray waves. On their decks, beneath armed guards and coiled ropes, sit the defeated soldiers of Hitler's once unstoppable army. Their boots, worn from North African sand, rest against cold American steel. For weeks, they have crossed an ocean they were once told they would conquer. Now it delivers them into the heart of the enemy's homeland. As dawn breaks over the eastern seaboard, the mist parts to reveal a sight no German soldier had ever imagined: the shores of the United States. Towering cranes, sprawling ports, endless trains, an empire of industry unscarred by war. For men who had seen Europe reduced to rubble, America looks impossibly untouched, impossibly vast, impossibly free. But behind the barbed wire and rifles, there is no hatred in the air. Only disbelief. These men, once hailed as the soldiers of the master race, now sit quietly as American civilians pause in astonishment. Housewives, dockworkers, and schoolchildren gather at the rails to stare at the strange cargo. Thousands of young blonde men in field gray uniforms, sitting obediently under the stars and stripes. Some wave, some smirk, a few weep. It was the most unusual sight either side had ever seen. The contradiction could not be sharper. The world had been told the Germans were monsters, ruthless, fanatical, unbroken. Yet here they were, polite, curious, and suddenly vulnerable. And for the prisoners, the myth of America, the land of greed, chaos, and racial decay as preached by Nazi propaganda, was shattered within minutes. The streets were clean. The people were kind. The food, plentiful. Even the guards smiled. It was not the America they had been taught to hate. Between 1942 and 1946, more than 425,000 German prisoners of war would be transported to the United States, scattered across more than 700 camps stretching from Maine to California. They arrived in long convoys through New York, Norfolk, and New Orleans, and were sent inland to the farmlands of Texas, Kansas, and Iowa, where labor was scarce and fear still lingered from Pearl Harbor. But this was no ordinary captivity. America faced a paradox: how to treat its enemy humanely without undermining its own war effort. The Geneva Convention promised fair treatment, but could a democracy remain moral while fighting tyranny? For many Americans, the answer came not from punishment, but from something more subversive: compassion. The German prisoners expected vengeance. Instead they found coffee, books, and baseball. They expected propaganda. Instead they were handed newspapers that told the truth. They expected hatred. Instead they met humanity. In the barbed wire towns of the American heartland, an experiment began. One that would test not only the prisoners' loyalty, but the very meaning of civilization itself. Because these camps were not just holding pens. They were classrooms, workshops, moral laboratories where two worlds collided: the defeated ideology of Nazism against the democratic ideals of the New World. And in that collision, something remarkable began to happen. Men who once fought for Hitler began to question everything they believed in. The story you are about to hear is not one of guns or glory, but of minds transformed and hearts disarmed. It is the story of how a nation's humanity became its most unexpected weapon. This is the story of what happened when German POWs arrived in America, and why it was the most unusual sight for them. By 1943, the tide of war had turned. After defeats at Stalingrad and El Alamein, Hitler's army was bleeding across continents. Allied forces, pushing from North Africa into Italy, captured tens of thousands of German soldiers. But Britain, already overcrowded and bombed to exhaustion, could not hold them. The United States, untouched, industrially invincible, offered a solution. Beginning in April 1943, the first shiploads of prisoners disembarked in New York and New Orleans. Many were stunned. "We thought America was a land of chaos," one prisoner later wrote. Instead, it was orderly, prosperous, and free of fear. From the ports, sealed trains carried the men inland under military escort. The windows were shuttered. Few had any idea where they were going. When the doors finally opened, they found themselves in the strangest of places: the wide-open plains of Texas, the cornfields of Iowa, the pine forests of Alabama. Their new home would be places like Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, and Camp McCain, small towns turned into fortresses of barbed wire and watchtowers. For the townspeople, the arrival was unsettling. Many had lost sons in Europe. Now, the very men they fought were working their farms. Rumors spread. Some feared sabotage, others saw opportunity. But when the first POW work details began picking cotton and harvesting wheat, something shifted. They worked hard. They obeyed orders. They even sang German folk songs under the American sun. The U.S. Army established a clear policy. Prisoners would be treated according to the 1929 Geneva Convention. They would receive adequate food, medical care, and the right to recreation and education. In return, they would provide non-military labor for America's wartime economy. The result was a silent army of farmhands, carpenters, and factory workers, men who harvested millions of bushels of grain and repaired roads across the nation. The irony was profound. While their homeland burned under Allied bombs, Germany's sons were feeding America's breadbasket. At first, the prisoners divided themselves by rank and ideology. Hardline Nazis, called Die Schwarzen or the Blacks, dominated the camps through intimidation. They held secret meetings, raised swastikas, and punished anyone who questioned Hitler's cause. American officers realized that within their fences, the Third Reich was trying to survive. So, a counter-strategy emerged, not with guns but with books. The Intellectual Diversion Program, launched by the War Department, began distributing thousands of German-language newspapers, pamphlets, and films explaining democracy, free speech, and the truth about Nazi crimes. American educators, professors from the University of Wisconsin, Stanford, and Yale, helped design classes that ranged from English and mathematics to philosophy and ethics. Prisoners who showed interest were transferred to special re-education camps, like Fort Kearny in Rhode Island, where lectures and debates replaced drills and punishments. Slowly the cracks appeared. Men who had once shouted, "Sieg Heil," began reading Shakespeare, listening to jazz, or corresponding with American pen pals. Others painted murals, built musical instruments, and staged theater plays. Their guards, often ordinary Americans no older than themselves, watched in disbelief as the enemy began to look, act, and even think like them. By 1944, the transformation was visible. Camp newspapers featured editorials questioning the Nazi war. Some camps organized mock parliaments to practice democratic debate. Even German officers, once symbols of arrogance, began mentoring younger prisoners to prepare them for life after the war. It was not a perfect process. Violence erupted when hardliners accused moderates of treason. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, a prisoner suspected of betraying Nazi ideals was murdered by his own comrades. But for most, the battle was internal, a struggle between loyalty to the past and faith in the future. As months passed, the camps became microcosms of a larger ideological war. On one side stood the remnants of Hitler's world: discipline, obedience, racial pride. On the other stood the American experiment: freedom, individuality, equality. The two collided daily in classrooms and mess halls, in conversations that began cautiously and ended in revelation. Letters home tell the story. "Mother," wrote one prisoner in 1945, "they treat us better here than we were treated in our own army." Another noted, "The guards laugh with us. They give us books. They do not fear us." Even American civilians began to soften. Farmers invited POWs to share meals at harvest time. Children learned German songs from their enemy helpers. In many small towns, affection quietly replaced fear. "They were boys, not monsters," one Texan woman recalled. "They just wore the wrong uniform." This growing empathy unnerved some officials. Could kindness breed weakness? Yet the statistics were undeniable. Escape attempts were rare, discipline was high, and production soared. America's humane approach had created cooperation, not chaos. In Washington, the program became a point of pride. The Army's Office of the Provost Marshal General reported that POWs provided over 45 million man-days of labor during the war. At the same time, re-education efforts had quietly converted hundreds of former Nazis into democratic sympathizers. Men who, after repatriation, would help rebuild West Germany. Listen closely and you can still hear their voices. A guard at Camp Herne wrote in his journal, "At night they sing. I can hear them through the wire, songs of home, songs of sorrow. I almost forget they are Germans." A prisoner remembered a small act that changed him forever. "One day a farmer's daughter brought us lemonade. She smiled. No one had smiled at me since Tunisia. That smile defeated me more than any bomb." At Christmas 1944, POWs in several camps carved wooden toys for local children. When word spread, churches invited them to attend Christmas services, escorted but welcomed. For men who had once been told they fought a holy war, this quiet gesture of grace struck deeper than any sermon. By 1945, the war was ending. The camps were full of news: Hitler dead, Berlin fallen, Germany in ruins. Some prisoners wept in disbelief. Others stood silently, faces turned west. They feared vengeance, starvation, annihilation. But America did not respond with cruelty. Instead, it offered return with dignity. Repatriation began in late 1945. Thousands of POWs boarded ships home, carrying new ideas they could barely articulate. Some returned to Soviet captivity in the East, where re-education meant brutality. Others, landing in British and French zones, spoke quietly of their time in America. "They taught us freedom," one said. "Without knowing it, they rebuilt us before we went home." The numbers tell one story. 425,000 German POWs in America. 700 camps. 45 million workdays. Almost zero mass escapes or uprisings. But behind those figures lies something more profound, a moral victory achieved without bullets. When post-war West Germany formed in 1949, many of its first civic leaders, journalists, and educators were former POWs who had spent time in America. Their experience behind American barbed wire had become a silent seed of democracy planted in defeated soil. The ships returned them across the Atlantic, but they were not the same men who had left. The young Wehrmacht soldiers who once believed in racial destiny had walked through small-town America and seen something far greater. Ordinary people living free, equal, and unafraid. They had seen a nation powerful not because of conquest, but because of conscience. For America too, the lesson endured. The country that had imprisoned its enemy learned that mercy could serve strategy. Its greatest weapon had not been the atomic bomb or the B-17, it had been the moral confidence to treat even its foes with dignity. Historians would later call it the most successful re-education experiment in modern history. But to those who lived it, it was something simpler. A moment when humanity triumphed quietly, one conversation, one shared meal, one handshake at a time. The irony lingers still. The men who once marched under the swastika found their first taste of freedom behind American fences. And the Americans who guarded them discovered that compassion could conquer where hatred could not. In the years that followed, the memory of those camps faded beneath the grander narratives of victory and loss. The barbed wire was torn down, fields reclaimed. But in small museums across Texas, Georgia, and Iowa, fragments remain. A carved wooden toy, a watercolor of a prairie sunset, a letter addressed simply to "My American Friend." They are relics of a quiet revolution, a reminder that civilization is measured not by how we punish our enemies, but by how we transform them. One German veteran, decades later, wrote to his former American guard, "I came to you as a prisoner. I left as a free man. You defeated me without hatred." That single line captures the story's soul. Because when the German POWs arrived in America, what astonished them most was not the food or the comfort, nor even the scale of American industry. It was the sight of mercy from the victor, the realization that decency could coexist with power. In that discovery lay the deeper victory of the Second World War, the reaffirmation that democracy's true strength is moral, not mechanical. It builds where others destroy. It forgives where others hate. The barbed wire may have rusted away, but the lesson endures. That even in war humanity can prevail. That freedom once seen cannot be unseen. And that sometimes, the most powerful transformation begins, not on the battlefield, but within the heart of a prisoner who has seen the light of another world. When German POWs arrived in America, it was the most unusual sight for them, because behind the fences they found something they had never known before. They found freedom.